Okay, thank you, and welcome to the Future of Law in Technology and Governance virtual seminar series presented by the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. I am Mike Madison. I am a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and I am delighted to have the support of the Center for this very interesting ongoing series. I want to welcome our speaker today, Catherine Henshin, who is a scholar in communication and political science at Northeastern University. And I'm not going to do much more of an introduction. I will simply turn the microphone over to her and her slide deck, and I will mute myself and be back in about 30 minutes where we'll open up the conversation to Q&A. Catherine, thank you for being here and welcome.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to talk about this. So just by general overview, I'm a scholar of political communication appointed in both the communication and political science departments. And most of my research involves field experiments, trying to use digital media to get people to do all sorts of political stuff, mostly voting, but increasingly volunteering. And so what I'm going to talk today about is basically the rise of text messages in politics. They've become really ubiquitous. I've done some of the research around using them for mobilizing voters and mobilizing volunteers. So I'm going to review what we know about them. And then since this is a law school, I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of, we'll call the shifting regulatory state around political texting. So behold, the humble text message, right? We all get them on our phone. In a very short amount of time, they've become really critical in political organizing. Over the last 5 to 8 years, uses of text messages for political purposes has really just exploded. And part of this is because over 98% of American adults have a cell phone of some sort, and about 85% of people have a smartphone, right? So people have phones that allow them to receive text messages, and these smartphones in particular, you can click through that text message to a donation page or click through to something else. And so everybody has a cell phone. Second, SMS open rates, in other words, the rate at which people read the texts you send them, is about 98%, right? So the vast majority of text messages are open and read, and that's about 5 times higher than the best email marketing rates, right? Emails increasingly being relegated to the promotions tab or just being deleted. People are ignoring email. The other thing is that everyone is texting, right? It's a misconception to think that just like the young people are texting. No, AARP has released a number of studies showing that 80% of people aged 60 to 69 are texting, and more than half of people aged 70 and up. And actually, older generations really have started to really like texting as a form of communication, right? So everybody's texting. So I'm going to talk today about how people are using text messages for political purposes. And then I'm going to talk specifically about this in terms of fundraising, voting, and then volunteer recruitment. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of where we are on the regulatory environment for text messages, since this is still a gray area. So what do we do with politics with texts? Well, 15 billion political texts were sent in 2022. That's a rough estimate. That's a lot of text messages. The way these are sent is you don't actually just upload a list of cell phone numbers and fire away. No, actually, individuals have to be logged into an app or a website, and they have to click a button. They have to click send. So every single one of, well, not every single one, but the vast majority, probably 14 billion of those political texts were sent by a person clicking a button. And it's very quick. You can, tap, 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 tap. You can send thousands of texts in a very small amount of time. And people love doing this as volunteering. It's really simple. You put Netflix on, you open up your texting app, and you just hit send a few thousand times, and someone else is handling the replies and things like that. We see it predominantly used for fundraising and voter mobilization, but it's increasingly being used in volunteer recruitment as well. So I'm going to talk to you about what we know about that. In 2020, across all the presidential candidates, 45% of the text messages they sent were fundraising. This has become a really, really common way for candidates to raise money. Again, everyone's got a phone, everyone reads their text messages. So let's just send people text messages asking for money. Alone or oftentimes combined with email, right? We're simultaneously going to send people an email and a text message. SMS works. People would not be still using this if it wasn't an effective way to separate money from people. And estimates suggest that SMS fundraising may account for about half of all campaign donations, right? So it's really starting to kind of in a way, maybe we'll say, maybe displace the money that was being raised via email. Now this money is often being raised by text message. So we do know that there is a lot of testing, A/B testing or experimentation around text messaging for fundraising. Often this is around the length of the message, the content, the words used, and then does it include images or not? Those are technically called MMS. They're more expensive to send, but maybe they are more distinguished in when someone reads them. And there does seem to be some anecdotal evidence that, I shouldn't say anecdotal, there's some proprietary evidence that these longer text messages, these many paragraph text messages that campaigns are sending, that are basically as long as an email, that they are actually effective, right? That the point is you're able to get this message to people, they open it, they read it, and if it's compelling, they're going to give money. Again, a lot of the research in this area is proprietary. There are organizations on both the political left and political right that do experimentation and aggregate results so that other people can know what works. But beyond that, even within an individual consulting firm or an individual campaign, oftentimes people keep the results of their testing private because there's a competitive advantage to being able to send the best text message that raises the most money, that you don't necessarily want to tell other people what your secrets are. So the big reason why SMS has become so popular for fundraising is essentially the decline of email. Campaigns still send a lot of email, but they have to get your email address and they have to send it to you, and you can really easily unsubscribe, send them to the spam folder. Depending on how your email is organized, you might not even see those messages in your main inbox. So email is sort of where the effect of email is sort of wearing off or attenuating. So in comes the text message, where people can, political consulting firms can get a hold of cell phone numbers of people that are regular donors and text them these fundraising requests. Okay, so that's basically what's going on in fundraising. There's a lot of it. It amounts for a lot of the text messages that are sent. And there is some internal testing around how to improve their functionality in terms of raising more money. Voter mobilization is also a major area of texting. I worked on an experiment with a co-author in 2018 where we partnered with a national political organization, a nonprofit, and we had 12 million people in this field experiment to see how effective text messages were. And we randomly assigned people into message content, timing, all of these different factors, sent them all their text messages, and we wanted to see if the text messages worked or not. And overall, in our experiment, if you were assigned to receive a text message, that group, the treatment group, voted at a 0.26 percentage point higher rate than the control group. 0.26 percentage points may not seem like a lot, but in a close election, that absolutely can make the difference between winning and losing. The other thing is, if you look across the body of voter mobilization research, if we look at canvassing and phone calls and direct mail, actually a 0.25 percentage point for something that is still mostly a mass communication one-way thing that you can just send very quickly to millions of people, that's still pretty good. It's more effective than direct mail, for instance, and on par with volunteer phone calls. Based on some of what we learned, because our experiment was so large, if we improve the data quality, if we only send text messages to people where we're pretty sure we're texting the right person, or we're pretty sure this is their actual phone number, and when we make sure to mention election day in the text message, right, that increases turnout to about a 0.46 percentage point improvement, or half a point. That's not bad. That's actually pretty good. Better than what we've seen from digital ads, which in the aggregate don't do anything. Email reminders to vote don't do anything. So the text message can actually increase turnout. And so this effect, as I noted, the 0.26 percentage point is on par with volunteer phone calls. That's about how effective it is to have a volunteer calling people, reminding them to vote, and probably a little more effective than direct mail. And we do know that the message matters. Not only do we need to text people a reminder to vote that emphasizes voting on election day. That may seem obvious to you, but if you don't put that in, the text message is not as effective. And also emphasizing the social aspects of voting. So even though a text message is kind of a personal, individual thing you get alone on your phone, in your hand, the more we can remind people that voting is a social act and that we need lots of people voting together, those messages are actually more effective than messages that simply remind people that the election is coming up. The other thing that was kind of fun is we had more money to spend than we thought. So we got to send some extra text messages at the end, and we sent single text messages to a bunch of voters, I believe in California and New York, late in the game. And even one text message close to election day is effective at increasing turnout, right? So these text messages work. The experiment we did sent people between 3 and 5. So we sent a lot of text messages, but even that one last text message can make the difference between someone voting or not. So beyond that, my co-author Chris and I looked across all of the known text message experiments. We found 22 text message experiments in the academic literature. And there's more in other countries. These are just in the United States. There's 22 field experiments on texting in the United States. There's a number of additional ones from Scandinavia. There's one from Kenya. So texting is popular all over the world, not just here. But of the ones in the United States, we analyzed them to see what the effect is. Like, can we draw any broader conclusions beyond just our one experiment? When I talk about these results, I'm going to tell you how effective texting is overall, just across all 22 of the experiments. But then I'm also going to tell you how effective they are by salience. Salience is basically how exciting an election is. A US presidential election or a US midterm election is high salience. These are higher turnout. There's more media attention, there's more campaign activity, more campaign communication, more people know the election's going on, and that just raises the rate at which people will vote. Low salience elections are everything else. So any election held this fall is by definition low salience. For those of you in Pennsylvania, I believe you have a state Supreme Court election this fall. That is low salience. School board elections, runoffs, anything that's not held on that first Tuesday in November of an even year, we categorize that as low salience. They just don't get as much attention. People don't know they're going on. Now, when we think about the sender of the political text message, we distinguish between what's called a warm text message and a cold text message. Warm means that the person has a relationship with the sender. So if I'm a member of Sierra Club and I've given them my cell phone number and I've opted in to letting them text me, that is a warm text message. You have an opt-in to text this person. And actually, with these warm messages, you can, in fact, send them. You don't need the person to click the button. You can send the warm text messages automatically because the people opted in. So this is different, right? Because if I'm interested enough in joining a political organization, I have some higher level of political interest than sort of the average person. Cold text messaging is when we use the voter file. We use commercial data sources to append cell phone number records to it. And then we're texting people because they fit some sort of criteria, right? Maybe they're young people or people who don't vote in a lot of elections, or they live in a very contested jurisdiction. That's called cold texting because there isn't necessarily a relationship. The sender might even be unknown. Doesn't have to be unknown. You might know of the group that has gotten your data and is texting you, but it's not the same as a person affirmatively signing up to be texted. So first, in our warm, if we look at all of our experiments using warm text messages, in all of these experiments, we see an effect of about a percentage point increase in turnout. And that's the same when it's in the high salience presidential or midterm. But what's really noticeable here is in these low turnout, low salience elections, these kind of uninteresting local school board runoff special elections, warm SMS increases turnout by 3 percentage points. That's huge. That's such a difference, right? That absolutely is the difference between winning and losing a school board election, right? So when we have these low salience elections, text messages from groups known to the recipient are really effective at getting more people out to vote. That is approaching the effectiveness of a volunteer phone call or having your door knocked on and actually talking to the person, right? It is on the effect of having a conversation with someone at the door on the phone, just from receiving a text message. In cold, again, we may not know who the sender is. We're just sending messages to millions of people, potentially just using voter file and consumer data. So they're less effective, about 0.4 percentage points across all these studies. In high salience, we're really only going to get about a quarter of a percentage point. And in a low salience election, we're still only going to get about 0.6 percentage points. So you can see here why it's effective, it works, but we really need to send a lot of text messages to start having an effect on increasing the election and increasing turnout and impacting the election. So that's why we see texting being done at the scale of, billions and billions of text messages, because really we have to talk to a lot of people to get enough additional votes that it's doing something to move the needle. So the other area in which texting is known to be happening is volunteer recruitment. And there's not a lot of research generally on volunteer recruitment in political science. Volunteers are important. They're the lifeblood of grassroots organizations, but it's kind of an understudied area. So something I've been curious about, having worked on campaigns for a really long time, is what is the effect of text messages on getting people to both sign up to volunteer, say you're coming, and then actually show up, right? Because it's not enough to just get people to sign up. You need them to come and do the thing they said they would do. Come knock on the doors, come make the phone calls. And so I've done a bunch of experiments with partner organizations. In fact, I'm working on one right now with a statewide group in Pennsylvania. That's not what I'm going to show you the results of, but we did a big one in 2022. We did a huge statewide volunteer recruitment experiment in Pennsylvania. So basically, we want to see what is the added benefit of the text message in terms of recruiting the volunteer. So most volunteer recruitment is done via email. You sign up with a campaign, you say you want to volunteer, and they send you an email. And they say, here's what's going on, sign up here. Maybe there's a link and you click it and you fill out a form and you're signed up. That's it. So that's really impersonal. And again, people aren't reading their email. It's going to spam, it's going to the promotions tab, right? You might just see it and be like, oh, I'll do that later. So we tested the addition of email. Everyone's still going to get their email, but what happens if you also get a text message asking you to volunteer? What if you actually get an email and then we call you, but if you don't answer the phone, we leave you a voicemail? Or what if we email you and we call you and you don't answer the phone, we text you, right? Because people don't like listening to their voicemails. I'm not going to tell you how many unread voicemails I have on my phone, but you get an unknown call from an unknown number, and if you don't have your phone set up to transcribe your voicemail so you can just read it, I'm not answering that. I'm not listening to that. I don't have time. So maybe if they don't answer the phone, we can just text them, and that's going to get the message across that we want them to volunteer. We did this for both getting people to sign up and show up, and then we did this as a way to confirm people in a second experiment. So we've got our volunteers, they're all signed up, we're all excited, they're going to come. Let's remind them of their commitment. So let's see if it worked. So in the volunteer recruitment experiment, the email and the text message increased show up rates in relative to the email only by 3 percentage points. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it was actually a 325% increase in volunteers, because the email alone only generated 4 attendees. Not good. The email with the text generated 13 attendees. So sending people an email, chasing it with a text message, gets more people to sign up, and then they eventually show up to the thing, right? We also saw something similar for the confirmation, that once people have already signed up, you send them their email, call them so they know you're calling to remind them, and then if they don't answer the phone, text them. And that generated a really substantial 30 percentage point increase in attendance, from about 43% in the email only group to 73% in the group that got the call and the text. So both of these found that text messages reduce what we call flake rates. Flake rates are when people sign up to volunteer and then they don't show, they flake out. And this is a huge problem in campaigning, because we don't want people to flake out. If we think 10 people are coming to volunteer, we have materials ready for 10 people. It's not good if 5 people show up. So it's also important that whatever we do doesn't just get more people to say they're coming and then flake out. And that's actually what we think what was happening with phone calls. People would feel on the spot like they had to say yes to the person who called them, and then they'd flake out. The text message is fast. We can send them really fast, and it's efficient. It gets lots of people to sign up. And so it successfully filters through our universe of potential volunteers for the people that actually want to volunteer at the specific event. And it seems to reduce flaking from people who felt pressured to say yes, who never had any intention of going. Because, like, you know, it's just a text message. I can blow off a text message. I don't need to say yes to some text if I don't want to do it. And so we find that actually, generally speaking, texting is not only effective, it's more efficient than calling, it's faster, and it does a better job of conveying, right, the information and getting the people to show up. Okay, so what's the problem? Texting is great. It gets people to donate. It gets people to vote. It gets people to volunteer. These are all socially good outcomes, pro-social outcomes. What's the problem? Abuse. We are seeing just so much political texting. Again, I mentioned the 15 billion texts in 2020 or 2022. That averages, it's actually 50 texts per cell phone number. If you look at the number of cell phone numbers and the number of texts, people are averaging getting 50 text messages. And that's not all at one time, but over the span of a few months, that's a lot of text messages. And people don't like it. There's also some particularly bad actors, and this tends to be the case that certain political consulting firms, and both the Democratic and Republican side of the aisle, really have no qualms with sending every single fundraising request to every single person on their list, and just basically, it doesn't meet the legal definition of spam, but it's really not welcome, right? These fundraising requests are really not welcome. And so that's part of the problem. There are people who say, well, this works. I'm going to burn it to the ground. I'm going to maximize what I can get out of text messages right now, even if I ruin it for everybody else, right? So that's the problem. Okay. Also making this challenging is, you know, and I'm not going to give you a good answer. I'm just going to tell you where things are at the current point. So in 2021, the Supreme Court issued a decision that sort of, how do I put this? Clarified what a quote unquote auto dialer is. So if you have a landline phone, you've probably at some point gotten a robocall. Maybe it was a recorded message selling you something. It could have been a poll, a political poll. It could have been a political call reminding you to go vote, right? Those are done with automated dialers. And those are allowed for landline phones. They're not allowed for cell phones. It is illegal to, well, it's a complaint-driven process, but basically you are not allowed to robocall a cell phone. And the Supreme Court limited the definition of what auto dialers were, such that these apps that let people push individual buttons to send text messages, they're clearly not auto dialers. A person pushing a button is not a robot. And therefore, this is the important part, because they're not auto dialers, they don't need consent to send. Because my button pushing, I'm not a robot, you don't need to opt in to receive text messages from me. I can just send them out. So, like the law said, well, I should say the law, but the current judicial decision on this is that there's nothing wrong with hitting this button millions of times and sending millions of text messages. But they're a huge source of FCC complaints. The biggest source of FCC complaints is about political text messaging. And I still work in politics a little on the side, and I ran a town-wide texting program in my town in the suburbs of Boston. And I can tell you that people really do not like getting these messages. And they ask you, where did you get my phone number? And I tell them in all honesty, you wrote it on your voter registration application, and then the town gave it to me when I requested the list of voters, right? People don't like this, but that's true. It's what happened. Nevertheless, people complain about these text messages, and they don't understand that a text message from Joe Biden is not the same thing as a text message from the Democratic Party, is not the same thing as a text message from your local candidate for state assembly. There's sort of the general lack of awareness about like the kind of way politics is, leads someone to feel like they're just getting tons and tons and tons of texts from the same person, or just they're getting lots of texts and they don't like it. People don't like it. Now, something did launch in the last year that is now in effect called Campaign Verify. And Campaign Verify is an attempt to crack down on spammers and malicious senders. Campaign Verify is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. And if you want to send political texts, you need to get verified as a legitimate sender. So you have to fill out a form and submit some paperwork that basically says, like, yes, I am a 501c3, C4, or PAC. I'm legit. I have a website. I make campaign finance disclosures, or you can get them here from my town clerk, right? This is where you can find them online or by request. I am legit. And then they process your application, and if you're given the green light, you get a little token, like a digital token, that when your text goes out from your texting platform, it tells the wireless carriers this person is not a spammer, right? This person's legit. And then the wireless carriers don't flag your texts and suppress them, they deliver them to the recipients, right? So this is the way that currently the wireless carrier is kind of going to function as the barrier to people getting lots of texts they don't want. This also has become necessary to at least through the texting platforms that I use for campaigns, I needed to do this campaign verification to get a local number. So if you want to text voters in your area, you want to have a number in the correct area code. And it was necessary to be able to send text only messages without images, which are much cheaper, right? So there's some procedural reasons why campaigns, there's a lot of carrot, right? There's a lot of carrot for why a campaign would want to go through the trouble of getting verified, right? You want to be able to have the local number, you want to send the cheaper text, and you want to make sure the wireless carrier actually delivers your text messages and doesn't just block them all. The other thing that's interesting is that when you write these text messages, you have to include the name of the sender, and you have to include a like text stop to opt out situation so that the person can quickly reply. And then once that person does, the texting platform blocks the sender from texting that person again. So there are some mechanisms in place to try and, shall we say, clean up the bad actors in this regard. The bigger problem is, I think you can look at this through the lens that the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, and Congress are unable, I will just say incapable, of regulating political technology. I've read FEC decisions around digital advertising, and I've read, these are people regulating federal elections, and they don't understand the difference between a URL, like an address, and a link, right? A hyperlink that we click. So there's, I think, and you can see that across the board in a lot of digital campaign stuff, that the higher level FEC, Congress don't have kind of the mojo to kind of step in and regulate this more. So so that's kind of where it is. That's where I'm going to leave it, right? These are allowed. These texts are allowed. People don't like them. There's some internal industry-wide ways to clean it up, but it's unlikely that there's going to be broader regulatory efforts beyond that, beyond kind of stuff at the margin to maybe try and make it a little less unpleasant for the recipients while still making it feasible to the political senders who, again, rely on these to raise money and get people out to vote. So with that, I thank you again for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine. So everyone, we have about 25 minutes, which is a generous amount of time. I'll open the floor for anybody who wants to wave at the screen, unmute, raise a hand, use the Zoom device. Ali?
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Thanks so much, Catherine. That was a really interesting talk, and like very informative too. It's really interesting to see those patterns and the text messages, especially since it's something that, everyone kind of experiences now. I had a question. So I feel like in my experience, the kinds of messages I've gotten have taken kind of different forms. Some of the messages are more of the form like, it's your responsibility as a citizen to vote, but they don't really tell me who exactly to vote for. They don't really give me any additional details. It's more like their influence is trying to get me to perform a civic duty. On the other hand, like, some of the other messages that we all get are, more specified in particular directions, vote for this person, vote for that thing, that sort of thing. I would be interested in knowing if like there's any way in the data at all to kind of test if the two different types of messages have different effects on the audience, or if or if kind of like the style of communication or the nature of the message actually plays a role in the outcome variables that you're looking at. Because that could be very, very interesting. I sort of think like, if somebody messaged me about a candidate that I didn't like, I might, get like a reaction that make me more likely to vote for the candidate that I do like or something like that. So I think there's like something interesting to think about here about, the content of the message and, how to further, how to further kind of get some more information about how exactly the nature of a message affects the actual like voting outcomes in which directions, and also in like the total aggregate direction. So that was something I thought about that was pretty interesting and related to some of the stuff I do. So I thought I would just mention that really quickly.
Yeah, so there's two things there. The first is the legal entity that's sending the text message. That's the first thing that's going to predict the message. And then what do we actually know about message content? So in politics, there are 4 rough categories of actors. There's 501c3s. These are nonprofits. Donations to them are tax deductible. They are allowed to inform and educate, but they are not allowed to lobby or take a partisan stance. So the organization that I did my 12 million person experiment with was a 501c3. We couldn't tell you who to vote for. We couldn't really have any sort of partisan thing. All we could do is tell you to vote. In practice, 501c3s certainly have some sort of political agenda. So they're going to target their outreach to the groups of people that will overwhelmingly likely support them, right? So if there's a demographic that 75% of the time supports your candidate or your party or your beliefs, there's a C3 I'm working with now that they have the way they say this is they have like a statement of principles. So it's not ideological, it's not partisan, it's just simply, these are the things we believe. So they're going to text the people who are likely to believe those things too, right? So then if you have a group of people where you think like 75% or better are going to be with you, just text all of them, right? So you can text all 100% of those people and you're going to be splitting them 3 to 1. This is great from campaign perspective, when you can find some pool of people that you can just talk to everybody and come out ahead like that. That's great. So it's C3 compliant. That's important because a lot of donors want that tax break. So they want to give to the C3, right? So C3 has to be nonpartisan, but you can tell people to vote. C4, you can lobby, you can offer partisan endorsements, but it can only be half of what you do. So it's not really efficient to text to the C4 unless someone like really just wants to put money in your C4 and not into your political action committee. So then you have regular PACs and super PACs, and the only difference being that some small amount of regulation exists on PACs and like no regulation exists on super PACs. So most political texting then is either going to be C3, go vote, go vote, go vote, or it will be from a PAC telling you specifically, or a candidate committee, right? A political entity telling you, a party, a candidate, a PAC, telling you who to vote for. And so that, again, though, it's targeted to people that are likely to be receptive to it if they target the correct person, right? If you get a message and it says like, hi, Helen, probably that text message was not meant for you in the first place, and they texted your number and they had some bad data. And that was something we found in our 12 million person study, was that it's called the quality, there's a confidence score, and unless you're texting the highest quality confidence scores, you're not texting the right person. We know this because we've run voter registration experiments. We tried texting a list of unregistered voters, and we're texting someone named Susie, and we noticed that the person who clicks through and registers is named Bob. Like, we've texted the wrong person, right? It's bad data. So yeah. So first thing that's going to determine the content of your text is the legal status of the sender. Now, in terms of message content, there is a lot of testing around that. Most of what people do is reflect and test messages that have been effective in other contexts, usually direct mail, to see if that effect carries over to texting. And it generally does. Like, there's certain types of messages that have certain psychological kind of effects that appear to be effective in the mail, in text messages, in digital ads. So yeah.
That's really interesting. I think like just the whole ecosystem is just, you know, from a political economy's point of view, it's just an interesting set of characters and an interesting set of
Yeah.
incentives that you know that kind of paints the picture here. So yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, great question.
Okay, great. Jesse and then Huafeng.
Hi, thanks. This is really interesting. And I'm sorry I came late, so I'm going to ask a question. And if you said I spent the first 15 minutes of my talk on that, then just ignore it. But so you mentioned that people really don't like these messages, and I'll say I've been on both sides of these messages. I received plenty of them on my cell, and I've also occasionally, not often, but occasionally worked with campaigns as a volunteer, doing texting, usually early on to sort of like engage people and talk about promoting candidates. And I've also canvassed door to door. So you say people don't like getting these texts, but in my experience, people also don't like having their doorbell rung.
No. And then they get mad that there's low voter turnout. And I just like, you can't have it.
Right.
Like,
so I guess my question is, do you have reason to believe that people like or don't like one of those more or less? You know, in other words, is the texting more harassing than the stuff that they find on their, you know, that's like, oh, they left me more of these flyers, you know? It's like I've had people after me on the street, you know?
Let me find, I have a helpful chart that can help answer this question. Okay, so the problem is this, right? People don't like stuff. So one reason I do field experiments and I study behavior is because people's self-reports are not always accurate. And I want to say kind of useless, but people's self-reports are really problematic. People, if you ask someone, did you vote? They're like, yes, because it's a social norm. There's a strong social norm that you do certain behaviors. And if you ask someone if they conform to the norm, they're going to say yes, because they don't want to like face social approbation or shame for failing to comply with the norm. So to some degree, as a person who does mobilization studies in political science, I don't care if people like it. I don't care if they like it or don't like it. I also, you know, I make my child eat vegetables, right? There's certain things we do because they're very important and worthwhile, and so like they need to happen. The only time in which we would maybe care is if there was ample evidence of backlash, and we do see from the most effective type of mail is social pressure mail, where you show someone their prior voting history and you attempt to induce feelings of pride for having voted in the past or shame. If you're trying to shame people for missing an election, they really don't like it. It is the most effective way to get them to vote, right? So we want to minimize backlash to campaigns and parties. So that kind of communication is usually sent by C3 organizations that exist solely to shame voters because it's a really effective way of getting them to vote. We know that if you praise them and then threaten to survey them later, it's as effective as shaming them, right? Because there's this like, oh, someone's going to know if I conform to the norm or not, right? So on the last, and there has been some interesting work looking at like accumulation of, you know, if you knock on a door a fourth time, is that worth it? Or should you go knock on another door once? So people are looking a little bit at like the frequency and intensity of treatment as a question. Because once something stops working or you see a decline, then you just shouldn't do it because you're like, you should rethink what you're doing. Now, as to the canvassing question, the problem is that people aren't home a lot of the time. They leave their homes. And when the canvassers can canvass and when the people are home doesn't necessarily line up. And that's in an environment in which everyone lives in a nice single family house without a fence and without a dog, right? Those are optimal, right? And it's nice weather and it never rains. These are optimal canvassing circumstances. The reality is that organizations need to reach people in apartments who work during the day or work overnight or travel a lot. So canvassing can work, but text messages, you're going to actually reach the person you want to reach. And canvassing only works when you can have that conversation. So a student in my class, I teach campaign strategy. A student in my class was telling me that he went canvassing over the weekend and he knocked on 60 doors and he talked to 3 people. And I was like, when did you go? And he was like, Saturday afternoon. And I was like, what was the weather like? He was like, it was beautiful out. And I was like, exactly. Right. I told him he should knock on the door harder, that he probably wasn't knocking on the door hard enough. But beyond that, right. Whereas if you texted all 60 of those people, you would have gotten the message to like 59 of them. I'm going to show you this chart from the meta-analysis I worked on that I mentioned about texting. Okay, so let's talk about a high salience election, high salience presidential midterm. This canvassing is this thick dashed line. And this is the effect of canvassing at the level of assignment. So if the most effective thing, if I am able to contact 100% of the people I canvass, I will get 3 more votes. I try 100 people, I get 100 people, I will get 3 more votes. Cold SMS is a quarter percentage point. The way you can read this chart is, here it is for canvassing. If my canvassing rate, if my contact rate is below 10%, when does this line cross this line right here? If my contact rate canvassing in a high salience election is less than 10%, I'm not exceeding the effect of the text message, right? So for my student whose contact rate was 5%, in a low salience election, and arguably since there's a Boston City Council election this fall and it's low salience, where's my student? Here's cold SMS canvassing. Yeah, okay. So in a low salience election, if your contact rate is less than, say, 12%, canvassing is not as effective as texting. So any one of these things, they're tactics, and we need to think about the way to deploy them. Like, this neighborhood's good for canvassing, let's go canvass these people. Oh, this rural area, like there's 10 miles between houses, no one's gonna walk or drive that, let's call them. But then, all the people we haven't been able to get a hold of, we should probably text them, because that we can text. Not everyone is successfully going to be found of, like the whole voter file doesn't have text numbers for everybody. So, it's kind of like a piecemeal, or like putting a puzzle together. Canvass the people you can get to who will be receptive to it. Call the people you can call who will answer their phone and be receptive to it. Text the people you can text.
Thanks. I have another question, but I'll wait for somebody else to.
Yeah. Why don't we go to Hofang Lee, and then Jesse will come back to you.
Hey, Catherine. Very nice talk. Thank you very much. I'm an assistant professor of public and nonprofit management with Gaspia at the University of Pittsburgh. So I do some other research with information and donation, all for the 501c3 nonprofits. So I have a question for you: is when you work with those nonprofit organizations, so do they have a contact database they can send out, or they need to recruit through like cold calls or what? So essentially, so you have such a humongous number of people that you can contact, right? Which is ideal for experiment. I'm just curious, okay, how the organization actually be able to reach them? Are they already in their contacts database, or they need to sort of figure out a strategy to recruit them?
Sure. So let's see. We'll take it sort of function by function. For voting, we do look at the effects amongst people who've given their number, they've opted in. We call those warm text messages. They're a little more effective, but that's probably because the person gave their cell phone number to a political organization, right? It's not just the text, it's that the person was interested. For cold texting, we take a publicly available voter file, or in practice, we go to a vendor who will sell us a voter file. And then we go to another vendor of commercial data and we'll say, match it up. Here's my 1 million voters, find cell phone numbers for them. And they'll go to the commercial data, and they'll match them up, and they'll give you a confidence score. How likely is it that this person is this person? And then they'll give you that list. not everyone will be on it. You don't want to waste your time on the bad matches. And then you can text off of that list. For
I see.
volunteer experiments, these are people who have already opted in to be contacted about volunteering. And so it's just a function of good organizing, right? You have a group, they're reaching out to people, asking them to sign up with them, give them their contact information, and then reaching back out. I don't think most people do. I've not seen cold volunteer recruitment. And I think it would be very jarring for a group that you are not affiliated with to text you and say, hey, do you want to volunteer this weekend, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's mostly just what they have in their own database from people. The other example of fundraising is, yes, it can be done with people who've opted in, given their cell phone number to a campaign, but also you could, in theory, if you were a fundraising consultancy, take lists of people that are known donors. It's public record. You could pull FEC donor lists and state level donor lists, and then match those to the voter file, and then match those to commercial data with cell phone numbers. So, and then text off of that. So it's some combination of people gave their information, they put their information in public record, or they their information was acquired from data vendors.
I see. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So it's kind of followed with the like technical aspects. So do you have a way, because I'm researching currently like people with a high information preference versus low information preference, right? So somebody before they vote, they already make their mind, okay, I like this, like this guy, I'm gonna vote for him, regardless of extra like information or news related to that, right? So when you send people information, will you be able to like distinguish two groups, one with low information preference because they need only a little bit of information they can make the decision, while the others they need more detailed information for comparison. So for instance, when you send a message, one message is very simple, right? Say, okay, please vote, right? While the other message might be a little bit more complex and fill in more like context, because people need that kind of information to make their decision. So I'm not sure if you think about this or something else that will be interesting.
There's two people I can direct you towards. So there, generally speaking, there's a lot of research recently about whether it's possible to persuade voters. And there's a debate that campaigns shouldn't bother persuading because there's very few people that can be persuaded, and should instead focus on identifying people that are very likely to support them and then turning as many of those people out. Because even in a presidential election, we're seeing turnout in the realm of like 60 to 80%. There's a lot of people that still aren't voting, right? And we can identify them and find them and overcome the hurdles they face in getting out to vote. There's a paper that's a little old now, but it's by, I'll put it in the chat. I think it's by Josh Kalla and David Brookman, that basically says persuasion. It's about political persuasion, and their case is that it's very hard to persuade outside of these very specific contexts. There's also a scholar named Alexander Coppock, who has looked at specifically the ability of television ads to persuade. And, you know, I'm not, oh, there was another, actually, you know, it's one of my favorite studies that I've read in a long time. It was in the British Journal of Political Science. It's by Victoria Scheinman. So basically, one of the criticisms of mobilizing young voters is, oh, they won't know who to vote for, right? Which is a very patronizing attitude towards young voters. So she did an experiment where she mobilized young voters and then went back after the fact to figure out if in a city council election, I think it was in San Francisco, did they find the candidate who best aligned with their issue position, right? And this is really tricky in town and municipal governments where it's not necessarily a clear left-right divide, right? Should we have housing? Should we not have housing? Should we have transit? Should we not? And she found that, yes, young voters were ultimately capable of getting educated enough to find the candidate who matched their policy preference. So they got mobilized, then they got informed, right? And so it's somewhat of a open question about, you know, about like what information to give. I'm on the board of my town's pro-housing organization, and we spend a lot of time telling people like, these are the pro-housing people, and people say like, well, what's pro-housing mean? And people say like, well, does that mean there's anti-housing people? And they think they're joking, and we're like, actually there is. And so there's definitely a pool of people who need a certain level of education, right? But I don't know how. It would be an interesting question to figure out, like, what is that, right? What are the things that people need, and how much? I
Right.
will tell you, there's a few experiments where people have been randomly assigned to get free newspaper subscriptions, and they don't do anything on turnouts, right? So sending people free newspapers didn't necessarily help.
Yeah.
So there, you know, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, a little bit, because ice cream might be like do a better job than newspaper, right? If people will send them an ice cream, they want to do that. But my question is relatively related to like how much information will actually impact their behavior. Like what kind of information, right? Yeah. So
yeah, no, it's an
good to
interesting
know.
question.
Yeah.
I think the Callan Brockman piece is interesting because they identify how when an incumbent takes an unpopular stance, and you
Mhm.
find the people in the district who are specifically mad about that or care about that, and then you
Right.
tell them that is an effective way to change their mind, right? So
Yeah.
people have different issues that they make their decision on. And so you would have to figure out what that is and then give them the relevant amount of information. And as they say in that paper, it's very hard and it's very expensive, right? And so we don't yet have great ways to do that.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll look it up. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last brief question and answer before we hit the top of the hour. We might go a little bit over, which is probably okay. Jesse?
Okay, so earlier you said, and I find it easy to believe, that the FEC and Congress can't get their heads around the tech enough to regulate this being the texting. So my
Arguably like
question-
digital politics writ large.
call it digital politics. If they could, what would you want them to do?
This is a great question. I've done some research on disclaimers on digital ads too. And like there you really come away from like feeling despair, right? So I think there's a challenge that realistically, Congress is a bunch of elected people, and the FEC usually is a bunch of people who, you know, some are great public interest attorneys, others are political hacks, right? So there's a real mixed bag at the FEC as well. I think the real challenge is to strike a balance between letting campaigns do the things they need to do to communicate to voters. It's very easy to say, oh, we shouldn't have micro-targeting in ads, right? So, okay, does that mean you want to see ads for someone running for sheriff in the other part of the country? Like, no, you don't, right? So there has to be some, like, it's the all or nothing approach doesn't really work, right? Okay, so maybe we can target by age and gender and geography. If you can target by age, gender, and geography, you can basically target by anything else, right? We're still a relatively like, if you think about like people, like if you're targeting by age, gender, and zip code, you can be pretty precise about who you want to talk to based on census patterns and where people live. There is a lot of the time, if we start taking away digital tools that are low cost, and what's amazing about texting, the group that I work with, we pay 2 cents a text message. We can text the entire town for $4,000, $8,000, right? That's not a lot of money. It gives small groups with small budgets a chance to reach a lot of people in a highly targeted manner, which is really effective. If we start taking some of those things away, then it actually favors the like big money interests who can just buy more TV ads and buy podcast ads and buy digital ads and buy out like every ad on a newspaper website. It will ironically take some of the more like grassroots accessible tools off the table. So, you know, I'm very annoyed. I get a barrage of unsolicited fundraising email, the texts. They drive me crazy. And I always hit stop, but it doesn't seem to necessarily stop them, probably because the sender has decided to play a little fast and loose with the regulations and how they're doing it. I would like to see that stopped a little bit. I think we could do a little bit more to root out bad faith actors. All of these things are complaint driven. The FEC is complaint driven. The FCC is complaint driven. So, and people don't complain, right? So what, like, you know, probably at the wireless carrier level, there would have to be some sort of, you know, stick, right, to stop the senders who are really taking advantage. I'm not sure exactly what that would look like. But that's not just sending too many text messages from someone I've never heard of, who I'm never going to give money to. That also, but they're sent to me. They say like, hey, Catherine, give us your money. I also get texts because I have a cell phone number from Chicago. I get texts for someone named Nancy who lives in Chicago. I am not Nancy. I don't live in Chicago. So there's also people who have bad data, and they also deserve to be kind of like smacked down a little bit too, where if you're sending texts like that's, I think, more spammy, right? So I think that there's ways to kind of work with the wireless carriers and the legit senders and say, you know, what does a good faith campaign look like? Let's make it so that if you're not doing that, yes, Kyra gets text messages for her dad. I ran into this problem. I got a phone match and it was able to match into the household, but not the right person. So we wound up texting all the like high school aged kids of the parents we were trying to reach. Then we just said, okay, tell your parents who to vote for. And but oops, you know, I've started getting texts in my son's name and he's 3.5. So I'm a little confused about that happening. Because he doesn't vote a lot. He doesn't really give money to candidates either. Last time I checked, he didn't have any money. So yeah, so I think that there's ways to like cut down the crappy texts that might make it a better experience for everybody.
Just really quickly, if I'm understanding you, a lot of what you're describing doesn't require congressional action or new laws or even new regulations. You're talking about enforcement. The stop thing is already a regulation. I mean, presumably, if they're required in order to be licensed or whatever you call it, to, you know, get signed off on and not be listed as spam, to have a stop link, then they're required to respond to that by stopping.
They are, but if I hypothetically had trying to think, there's someone who just keeps texting me even though I text them stop. They must have multiple accounts on the same platform and they're just cycling the same list through different accounts. So if I tell account A to stop, and then they just put me in account B, and then I tell them to stop, and then they put me in account C, right? So they're like circumventing
Got it.
what's in place. That's hard, right? That's part of the challenge of regulation. Do you regulate around the good actors or do you regulate around the bad actors, even if that means curtailing some of the good actors?
So
Thanks.
I hate to interrupt and stop, but we have to stop. I'm just going to make one very, very brief conclusion, not to claim the last word, which I'll give to you, Catherine, but to say, as an intellectual property lawyer, this entire conversation from the beginning has reminded me very much of ongoing research on trademarks and advertising and branding, where increasingly, of course, there's a very complicated legal system around all of that, which has to wrestle with the fact that consumers in the commercial space don't really value trademarks for their informational content. It's really more the affective responses that we have to what brands say about who we are. So I worry that the political sphere continues to invest a lot in so the informational content of text messaging and other political communications, whereas the effects, Catherine, that you described in a lot of your experiments, the fact that text messaging does prompt a response, a measurable and significant response, despite the fact that huge numbers of people don't like them. It may be sort of the mechanism of response rather than being triggered by the actual content beyond certain limits of the message themselves. It's just a very fascinating area. So Catherine, I will give you the last word. I don't want to claim that privilege. Any last thought on your part?
I guess when you do get a political text message, remember that a person did send it on the other end and clicked a button. Someone is reading your response. So, just remember it's not being sent by a robot. There is a person behind it.
All right. That's great. Thank you very much, Catherine, for a very engaging and stimulating talk. Thank you for everybody else for being here today. Ali, I think you can hit the close and stop recording button.